The wine glass left her hand before Asha Devereux understood that it had been knocked there, and for half a second it hung in the chandelier light, full and red and turning, and then it came down against the edge of the long table and broke, and the sound of it went through the ballroom of the Larchwood Lodge like a struck bell. People 3 tables away flinched. A server near the far doors stopped with a tray held against his chest. And in the small, terrible quiet that followed, the only thing anyone could hear clearly was Spencer Ashworth's voice, low and tight and meant for her alone, but carrying anyway. The way a man's voice carries when he has forgotten there is anyone in the world he needs to perform for. "Be grateful," he said. "Be grateful I married you." His hand was still half raised. He had not slapped her so much as shoved her, the flat of his palm catching her shoulder and the side of her jaw as she turned. But the effect was the same. Her earring had come loose and lay on the white cloth among the spilled wine like a small drop star. She did not pick it up. She sat very still in the chair, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked out at the room. At the 200 guests of the Ashworth family's 40th anniversary gala. At the senators and developers and Old Bay Street money in their dark suits and their pale gowns. And she watched with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, as every last one of them found something urgent to study on their plate. Outside, the snow came down over the Rockies in a soft white avalanche of itself, blanking out the mountains, pressing against the tall windows so that the glass looked like sheets of paper. The fire in the great stone hearth went on crackling, as though nothing in the entire province had changed. Constance Ashworth sat 4 seats up the table with her chin level, and her face composed into the particular stillness she had spent 50 years perfecting. She had managed the family name through 3 recessions, 2 divorces that were not her own, and 1 scandal involving a nephew that had cost the better part of a decade and a wing of a hospital to bury. She did not look at her son. She did not look at the woman her son had just struck. She turned her water glass a quarter turn on the cloth, as though correcting a flaw only she could see, and she said nothing, and her silence was the loudest permission in the room. Bennett laughed. He was Spencer's younger brother, 36, a man who had never in his life waited in a line he could not pay to skip. It was not a real laugh, just a short push of air through the nose, a sound a person makes when something has confirmed a thing they already believed. "Well," he said to the man beside him, "just loud enough. Guess she finally remembered where she sits." A few people near him shifted in their seats. The man beside him looked at the orchids. No one answered him. 3 chairs down, the Honorable Yvonne Lavoie pressed her lips together and looked at her hands. She was the Federal Minister of Justice. She had flown in that morning from Ottawa, had shaken Constance's hand at the door, had told a small circle of guests over the first course a charming story about her grandmother's farm outside Trois-Rivières. She was a guest. She had always told herself, an ally of this family. She looked at the centerpiece, at the white orchids, and the sprigs of cedar, and she found that she could not make herself look anywhere else. Asha touched 2 fingers to the corner of her mouth and brought them away, and looked at the thin line of blood on them, dark in the gold light. She was 43 years old. She had spent 11 years married into this family, and most of those years she had spent learning, slowly and at enormous cost, how to take up less room. How to lower her voice in a way that did not look like lowering her voice. How to laugh at the right pitch. How to stand at the edges of photographs so that no one would have to ask her to move. And sitting there in the ruins of the silence, with the snow erasing the mountains and her own blood drying on her fingertips, she understood something with the strange calm of a person who has just stepped off a ledge they did not know they were standing on. She had reached the end of something. She could not yet have said what. She only knew the quiet in the room had changed its texture, the way a house changes the instant a window breaks somewhere down the hall and the cold comes in. Her phone, face down beside the bread plate, buzzed once, then again, then a third time, fast, one on top of the next. She turned it over. The screen held a single line from a number she had not expected to see tonight. Her chief of staff, a woman who did not text in italics and did not exaggerate and had once gone 4 months without using an exclamation mark. It's live. Turn on a screen now. And below it, 10 seconds later, Asha. They just said your name on national television. Find a screen. She looked at the message for a long moment. Around her, the party had already begun the careful, practiced work of folding itself back into normal. Conversations restarted at the far tables. A server moved along the wall, refilling water with his eyes lowered. Constance had turned to murmur something to the woman on her right about the road conditions for the morning drive down to Calgary. Spencer had sat back down. He had picked up his fork. He was eating, mechanically, the way a body eats when it has been trained since childhood to perform calm over anything at all. Asha stood. She set her napkin beside her plate, unhurried. She picked up the small evening bag from the back of her chair, and she walked out of the ballroom, and the click of her heels across the slate floor was, for the second time that night, the only sound anyone could hear. She had not always known how to walk out of a room. That was the part none of them understood. The part that the women who would later watch the clip and ask, with real bewilderment, why did she stay? Why would anyone stay? Could not see from where they stood. Because the woman in the black gown, walking out of the Larchwood Lodge, had once been a girl in the north end of Halifax, in a narrow house with a furnace that quit every February, the youngest of four, raised by a mother who taught grade 10 English by day, and cleaned offices on Barrington Street 3 evenings a week so that the lights would stay on. Asha had grown up understanding 2 facts at once and never confusing them: that she was loved completely, and that the world had already decided most things about her before she walked into any room. She had gotten out the way people like her get out, which is to say by being twice as good and half as visible. A scholarship to Dalhousie. A degree in computer science she paid for, partly by tutoring the children people who did not quite remember her name. A small, stubborn idea about how hospitals could read the patterns in their own data and catch the sick patients before the sick patients knew they were sick. An idea she built on a borrowed laptop in a basement suite. An idea that became a company. That became, over 15 quiet, relentless years, a thing called Boreal. She had met Spencer when Boreal was still small, and still hers, and still unknown. When she could go to a dinner party and be the most interesting person there, without a single person in the room knowing it. He had been charming then, in the way that men raised inside money are charming, which is to say effortlessly and without ever having had to learn how. He had seemed, in those first months, genuinely unbothered by who she was and where she came from. She had mistaken that for a kind of courage. It had only been a lack of attention. He had not minded her origins because he had not in any real way registered them. The minding had come later, and it had come slowly, and that was the thing that kept her. That was the answer to the question 200,000 strangers would eventually shout at their screens. It had never arrived all at once. If it had arrived all at once, she would have left all at once. Instead, it had come in increments so small that leaving over any single one of them would have made her seem unreasonable, even to herself. There had been the family portrait, in the second year, on the lawn of the Ashworth estate in Muskoka, the photographer arranging everyone, and Asha placed at the edge of the group, and then in the second arrangement, somehow not in the group at all, drifted just past the boundary of the frame, standing on the grass with a glass of champagne, while the official Ashworth family portrait was taken without her. No one had said a word about it. She had told herself it was an accident of staging. She had stood there on the lawn and watched the photographer pack his lenses, and she had decided, with the discipline that had built a company, not to make a scene. There had been the spring luncheon, the year after, when she was standing near the buffet, and a young man from the catering company, new and earnest, had approached her and asked, politely, if she could point him toward the kitchen. Having concluded, from where she stood, and from looking at her, that she must be staff, she had pointed him toward the kitchen. She had done it kindly. She had not let her face change. And she had driven the 4 hours back to the city that night, with her best friend, Yolanda, in the passenger seat, holding her hand and saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have made it smaller than it was. There had been the comments about her hair, which began in the third year and never quite stopped. Bennett's, mostly, dressed up as compliments. So brave, so striking, so much of it. There had been the way Constance introduced her at functions, always a half beat too late, always with a small downward inflection on the word wife. There had been the dinner, where a developer from Vancouver had assumed she was Spencer's assistant, and Spencer had let the man go on, believing it for nearly a full minute before correcting him, and had told the story afterward as though it were funny. And against all of that, every year there had been Spencer's voice, in the dark, saying the thing he said when she raised any of it, the thing that was the foundation under the whole house. You'd be nothing without this family. You should be grateful. She had stayed, because she had spent her whole life being told she did not belong in rooms, and she had wanted, more than she could admit even to Yolanda, to belong in one. She had stayed because Boreal was hers, and the marriage was the one thing she could not engineer or scale or fix with effort. And she could not stand to fail at it. She had stayed because the cruelty had a slope so gentle you could not feel yourself sliding. And she had stayed, in the last years, for a reason she was ashamed of and would only understand fully much later. Because she had begun, quietly, to make herself ready to leave. And a person mid-construction does not walk out of the house. Because while she had been shrinking at the Ashworth dinner tables, Boreal had not been shrinking. Boreal had been doing the opposite, in the way that mattered, out where the family never looked, because the family did not think of her as a person with a life of her own. In the 18 months before that gala, Boreal had moved from quiet success into something that the people who watched these things did not have a calm word for. Its diagnostic platform had been adopted by health systems across 4 provinces, and then across the border, and then across an ocean. There had been an offer to be acquired that she had refused, and then a larger one she had refused, and then finally a decision, made with Yolanda and 2 lawyers she had trusted for 20 years, made carefully, made on her own terms, to take the company public. The listing was set for Monday morning on the Toronto Stock Exchange. It was expected to be the largest technology debut in the country's history. None of the Ashworths knew. Spencer knew his wife had an app thing. Constance referred to Boreal, when she referred to it at all, as Asha's little firm. It had never once occurred to any of them to find out, and Asha, in the long, slow education of those 11 years, had learned to let people's assumptions about her stand uncorrected, because correcting them had always cost her more than it was worth. What she had not planned for, what no one had planned for, was that a major American network would break an embargo. That a business desk in New York, hungry to be first, would run the story Saturday night instead of waiting for the Monday bell. That at 20 minutes past 9, Atlantic time, while a man in a tuxedo wiped his wife's blood off the back of his hand, the financial news of 2 countries would simultaneously light up with her face. In the lounge, off the ballroom where a handful of older guests had retreated to the leather chairs and the good scotch, a television above the bar was tuned, on low, to a national news channel that ran in the corner of every such room in the country out of habit. A retired judge named Aldous Crew was the first to look up at it, because the anchor had said a name that he was almost certain he had just heard, an hour earlier, being introduced at the head table as somebody's wife. The screen showed a business correspondent standing in front of the lit-up tower of an exchange. Behind her, a graphic, and on the graphic, larger than life, a photograph of Asha Devereux. Not the careful, diminished woman of the Ashworth dinners, but Asha as the rest of the world had been quietly coming to know her. In a plain dark blazer at a podium, her chin up, her eyes direct, the founder and chief executive of a company about to be valued at a number with too many zeros for the human mind to feel. The correspondent was talking about a self-made fortune, about a girl from public housing in Halifax, about 15 years and a borrowed laptop and a hospital algorithm that had, by the network's own conservative reckoning, already saved tens of thousands of lives. She was talking about Monday's listing, about the analysts who could not get a meeting with the famously private founder, about the venture funds and the family offices, and the old money investors across the country, who had been trying for 2 years to get into Boreal and had every door closed in their faces. Aldous Crewe, holding his scotch, did the arithmetic slowly, the way an old man does, and felt the bottom drop out of the evening. Because he knew for a fact that at least 11 of those frustrated investors were in the ballroom 40 feet away, because he had himself, 2 months prior, asked a colleague to find some way, anyway, to get him a half hour with the head of Boreal. And the head of Boreal had been sitting at the Ashworth head table, being struck across the face for taking up too much room, while the most powerful people in the room ate around her in silence. He set his glass down on the bar without finishing it, and he went to find the remote. What happened next happened the way these things happen, which is to say, not as a single dramatic gesture, but as a slow, contagious turning of heads. A girl from the catering agency, 17, working the Gala blonde for the season through a placement office in Banff, had been standing near the service corridor when the glass broke, close enough to see Asha's face in the second after the blow, and she had, without quite deciding to, lifted her phone and caught 30 seconds of it before the sound startled her into lowering it again. She had not known what to do with the 30 seconds, but she had heard, from the kitchen, the cooks crowded around a tablet, saying a name. Boreal, Boreal, did you hear? And she had felt, with the certainty of someone who has not yet learned to talk herself out of certainty, that the 30 seconds on her phone and the name on the tablet were the same story, were halves of one thing that the room out there had not yet put together. So when Aldous Crewe carried the lounge remote into the ballroom and pointed it at the large screen mounted above the hearth, the screen used for the slideshow of 40 years of Ashworth photographs, that no one had bothered to turn off, the catering girl was already there beside the bar, watching to see if the room would understand. It took the room about 8 seconds. 8 seconds of forks, moving and low conversation, and a woman at the third table finishing a sentence about her son's wedding. And then the broadcast filled the wall above the fire, the exchange, the graphic, the photograph, the number. And the voices began to go out across the ballroom, one after another, like streetlights, switching off down a long road at dawn. Because the face of the fire was the face of the woman who had walked out of that room 10 minutes earlier with blood on her lip. And the voice from the screen was reciting, into the silence, everything she was, and everything she had built, and everything she had been before she had ever heard the name Ashworth, and had spent 11 years being made small inside it. Constance Ashworth set down her wine glass. She set it down very carefully, and for the first time in the living memory of anyone at that table, her face was not composed. It was simply, nakedly, a face doing arithmetic of its own. The family company on Bay Street that had been quietly bleeding for 3 years, the bridge financing she had been unable to secure, the long list of investors who would no longer take her calls. She was beginning to understand, in real time, in front of 200 people, exactly whose money she had been refusing to be in a room with. Spencer had gone the color of the tablecloth. He half stood, and he said something. 2 sentences. 3. A thing meant to explain, to frame, to make the past 10 minutes into something other than what they had been. But the room was no longer listening to him with the kind of listening that produces belief. The room was listening to the wall above the fire. And then the Honorable Yvonne Lavoie stood up. She stood the way people stand when they have understood that a moment has come which is going to require them to be a better version of themselves than they have so far been willing to be, slowly, and with no pleasure in it, because she would have to live, for the rest of her life, with the fact that she had sat through the first part. She looked at Spencer. She looked at Bennett, who was no longer laughing. She looked at Constance and her wine. "That woman," said the Minister of Justice, in a voice trained to carry to the back of the House of Commons, "is the woman I just watched your son assault in front of 200 people." And I sat in my chair and I said nothing. She let that land. "I am not going to say nothing now." She picked up her bag. She walked the length of the ballroom and out the slate-floored hall, and the snow came in around the door when the staff opened it for her. And the sound of her leaving was the loudest thing in the building. Asha was already in the back of a car when the calls began, the heater running, the mountains gone behind the storm. Yolanda beside her, holding her hand the way she had held it on the long drive home after the spring luncheon all those years before. The phone rang and rang. The chief of staff, the lawyers, 3 reporters, a producer, a number she recognized as the office of a man who had spent 18 months unable to get a meeting with her. She did not answer any of them yet. She watched the snow come down through the windshield, and she let herself feel, for the first time in 11 years, the full size of a feeling without first checking the room for permission. It had no clean name. It was grief and fury and relief all braided into one chord, and underneath them, almost frightening in its plainness, something she did not yet dare call by its name, which was joy. "Well," Yolanda said quietly, looking at her, "there it is." The consequences came in the order such things come. The 30 seconds the catering girl had filmed were on the internet by Sunday afternoon, and on the national news by Sunday night. And they were unambiguous in a way that no statement from a public relations firm could blur. The Crown laid a charge of assault on the Tuesday. Spencer Ashworth, who had never in his life faced a consequence his family could not absorb, discovered the specific texture of a situation no one could buy quiet, and his family's lawyers told him, with the flat honesty that very expensive lawyers reserve for clients who are not going to like what they hear, that the smartest thing he could possibly do was plead to exactly what he had done and be grateful. There was that word again. For the leniency he had not earned. The fallout for the others was quieter and, in its way, more lasting. Yvonne Lavoie gave one interview, brief and unsparing, in which she said that she had failed a basic test of decency by staying in her seat, and that the only thing she could do with that failure was to make sure her department's domestic violence funding stopped being the line item it was easiest to cut. The retired judge, Aldous Crewe, wrote a letter to a newspaper that a great many powerful people read, and that a great many of them recognized themselves in. Constance Ashworth's calls went unreturned with a new and permanent finality, and the family company that bore her late husband's name slid the rest of the way down the slope it had been on. And there was no daughter-in-law's fortune to catch it now, because the daughter-in-law was gone. Boreal listed on the Monday, and Asha Devereux stood on the floor of the exchange in Toronto and rang the bell, and her photograph the next morning was on the front page of every paper in the country. Not the woman at the edge of the family portrait, but the one in the middle of the frame, exactly where. It turned out she had been all along. The only thing that had changed was that the frame had finally been opened wide enough to admit her, and the people who had spent years deciding it could not contain her were no longer the ones holding it. She did not, in the end, give many interviews about the Ashworths. The question the whole country was asking, why did she stay so long? She answered only once, and not the way they expected. She answered it by talking about the women who had no broadcast coming, because that was the part that had stayed with her. In the back of the car, in the snow, even through the joy. The understanding that her name had appeared on a screen at the exact moment she needed it to. And that this was not justice but luck, and that there were women all over the country sitting at tables exactly like hers tonight, whose names would never appear on any screen at all, who would be made small year after year with no camera crew, and no listing bell, and no minister to finally stand up. So 4 months later, she started a foundation, and she did not name it for herself. She named it the Esther Devereux Fund, for her mother, who had cleaned offices on Barrington Street so the lights would stay on, and who had taught grade 10 English for 31 years out of a stubborn and unkillable belief that everyone is owed dignity, whether the world is prepared to extend it or not. The fund did one plain thing. It paid for lawyers, and for first month's rent, and for the locksmith, and for the bus ticket. For women leaving the kind of marriage Asha had left, with a particular eye on the women whose situations were knotted up with race and class and money, in ways the existing services were never quite built to untangle. Yolanda ran it out of an office in Halifax, 6 blocks from the school where Esther had taught, and she ran it the way she ran everything, without drama and without taking any credit, and every Wednesday morning she called Asha with an update that always included one story from the helpline. Never the worst ones. Those were not hers to tell, but the ones where something had moved, where a woman had taken a step, where the fund had been the thing that made the step possible. Those were the Wednesday calls Asha cleared her whole schedule for. Esther watched all of it from the brick house in the North End, where the furnace still quit every February, where there were books on every surface and something always going, in a pot on the stove, and the particular slant of late afternoon, light through the kitchen window that her daughter could close her eyes anywhere in the world and see. She had raised 4 children on a teacher's salary and a cleaner's wages and a refusal, total and lifelong, to be made to feel small in a country that had given her plenty of invitations to feel exactly that. She had told Asha once, when Asha was 9 and had come home from school with a story about a teacher who had assumed things, the only piece of advice she ever gave more than once. Don't you make yourself smaller to fit a room, make them widen the door. On the evening the foundation's first full-year numbers came in. 1,100 women helped, 4 provinces, a waiting list that broke her heart, and a board of 3 retired judges who had volunteered without being asked. Asha called her mother from the back seat of a car, the way she did most evenings now, and they talked for somewhere between 12 and 30 minutes about the numbers and the weather in Halifax, and a book Esther was reading, and the neighbor's new dog, about everything and nothing, in the particular rhythm of a daughter who has finally stopped editing herself before she speaks. And when they had said the things there were to say, and Esther had said her name, in the way she had always said it, the way that had always made Asha feel like herself, there was a small silence on the line, the comfortable kind, and then her mother said, the way she had been saying it for 40 years. Good night, my girl. Take up your whole seat. Asha looked out the window at the lights of the city going by, and she did.